Grant Holloway returned from a forestry contract expecting weeds and an overflowing mailbox. Instead, he found a slab where his century-old farmhouse had stood. HOA President Marlene Whitaker had declared the home abandoned, forged emergency demolition papers, and sent bulldozers in while Grant was 3 states away. She thought distance had erased his rights. She did not know the house contained architectural records, hidden security backups, and evidence tying her board to a multi-million-dollar land scheme. When Marlene walked into court smiling, the judge opened one sealed file and ordered the HOA to rebuild everything and pay Grant $12 million. Grant came back to Silver Pines after 6 weeks working in a national forest in another state, expecting nothing more than overgrown grass, a few fallen leaves, and a stretch of fence the wind had probably knocked loose. But the moment he turned onto the dirt road leading home, he noticed the maple trees lining the entrance had been cut back in a way that made no sense. The wooden sign bearing the Holloway family name was gone from the gate. The iron mailbox lay crushed in the drainage ditch, as though something heavy had rolled straight over it without slowing down. When Grant rounded the final bend, the farmhouse that had stood for more than 100 years was simply gone. All that remained was a cracked concrete foundation, a few pipes jutting out of the bare earth, and a pile of shattered brick pushed against the tree line at the edge of the forest. Grant sat frozen behind the wheel, unable to convince himself he was even in the right place. The house had been rebuilt by his grandfather from an old lodge, originally constructed in 1898. And every family record, every handmade piece of furniture, and his entire professional office had been inside it when he left. He climbed out of the truck slowly, his boots crunching against gravel and broken glass scattered across ground that no longer resembled his own front yard. 46 acres of woodland stretched behind the empty foundation, silent except for the wind moving through branches that had somehow survived whatever machinery had come through. Grant walked the perimeter twice, half expecting the house to reappear if he simply looked at the right angle, but the absence remained total. He thought of his grandfather's hands shaping the porch railing decades earlier, of his own childhood bedroom, of case files and forestry contracts stored in filing cabinets that no longer existed in any physical form. He called the sheriff's department immediately. While he waited, he noticed a sign staked into the ground near the foundation printed in bold block letters that read that a dangerous structure had been removed by order of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. Beneath the text was a signature belonging to the association's president, Marlene Whitaker. Sheriff Wade Mercer arrived at the scene not long after, and Marlene appeared only minutes later, dressed as though she had been expecting the confrontation and had prepared for it in advance. Marlene claimed the house had been abandoned, structurally unsound and dangerous to the surrounding community. She insisted the association had sent multiple notices that went unanswered, leaving the board no choice but to act. Grant asked to see the county's actual demolition order. Marlene produced only a photocopy with a blurred stamp, telling him the original was safely stored within the association's legal files. Grant told her flatly that his land had never belonged to the Homeowners Association, that the deed predated Silver Pines by nearly 40 years, and that the title explicitly exempted his property from any association authority whatsoever. Marlene answered coldly that the boundaries had recently been updated. She warned him not to disturb the rubble himself, claiming the association was considering placing a lien on the land to recover its demolition costs. Grant did not raise his voice in front of her. He only asked her plainly whether she had destroyed his home and now expected him to pay for it. Marlene smiled and told him he should be thanking the association for eliminating a hazard. As Wade examined the paperwork more closely, he noticed the file number stamped across the order did not match the format the county actually used. Wade asked Marlene directly for the name of the county inspector who had approved the demolition, and she hesitated before offering a name that Wade did not recognize from any roster he had worked with over the years. He asked her to produce contact information for that inspector, and Marlene said she would need to check the association's records and get back to him. Grant watched the exchange carefully, noting how quickly Marlene's composure slipped whenever a question required a specific, verifiable answer rather than a broad assurance. He said nothing further, choosing instead to let Wade continue asking the questions that mattered most. The next morning, Grant received a certified letter from the association. Silver Pines demanded payment, covering $96,000 for demolition costs, $38,000 for material disposal, $22,000 in penalties, for an unsafe structure $18,000 in legal fees, and $10,000 for emergency management, bringing the total to $184,000. If Grant failed to pay within 30 days, the association threatened to place a lien on the property and petition the court for a forced auction of the land. Grant carried every document he had to attorney Tessa Monroe. After reviewing the deed and the county plat maps, Tessa confirmed that Grant's land had never joined the Homeowners Association in the first place, meaning every authority Silver Pines claimed to hold simply did not exist under the law. She noticed something even more troubling buried in the paperwork. Grant's property sat directly between the Silver Pines development and a newly planned highway corridor. Whoever controlled that parcel could build a private connector road straight to the highway, dramatically increasing the value of every home inside the community. Grant remembered that Marlene had approached him 3 separate times about purchasing a narrow 6-acre strip running through his farmland, and each time he had declined. The last time she asked, she told him he would sell. Eventually, he simply did not know yet how it would happen. Tessa immediately sent a formal notice demanding the association preserve every email meeting record, invoice security recording, and document connected to the demolition. Within 2 hours, the association's website suddenly announced a server malfunction, and several meeting records vanished from public access without explanation. Grant and Tessa traveled to the county building department to verify the demolition order directly. Staff searched by file number and found no record of any permit application connected to Grant's property whatsoever. The seal stamped across Marlene's documents belonged to a design the county had stopped using 3 years earlier, and the inspector's signature attached to the order did not match any employee on file. Tessa concluded that the association had not merely overstepped its authority, but that someone had actively forged government documents to make the destruction of the house appear legitimate. While the investigation continued, Grant returned to the property to check a weather monitoring post buried deep in the tree line. The post ran on solar power and included a small wildlife camera he had installed years earlier to track deer movement through the property. The lens did not face the house directly, but it did capture a portion of the driveway leading in. The memory card inside had been removed, but the system automatically uploaded motion-triggered clips to a remote server Grant had nearly forgotten existed. He logged in and watched a line of trucks, excavators, and bulldozers rolling onto the property at 5:41 in the morning, led by Marlene's white sport utility vehicle. Grant and Tessa reviewed the entire camera archive together. The demolition had lasted nearly 9 hours, and Marlene had not simply authorized the work from a distance, she had personally supervised every stage of it. She walked the perimeter of the house, pointed at specific walls, and instructed the crew to tear out the porch foundation, the water well, the storage barn, and the stone fence lining the property as well. One clip captured contractor Nolan Price asking Marlene directly whether they held a valid permit, and Marlene handing him a folder while insisting the homeowner had abandoned the property and that the court had already authorized the association to act. Nolan reluctantly continued the work. Grant felt something break inside him as he watched the roof collapse, recognizing the wooden table his father had built, crushed beneath an excavator alongside the dining room wall. His office containing the records of his entire career had been destroyed, with no attempt made to move anything out first. Tessa asked Grant to hold off on releasing the footage publicly, wanting to wait until Marlene formally testified under oath that she had never been present at the scene, so the recording could be used to expose the lie directly. They filed for an emergency order preventing the association from placing a lien on the land entering the property again, transferring or selling any interest connected to the parcel, or destroying any further documentation. At the preliminary hearing, Marlene arrived with the association's attorney and claimed the board had relied entirely on a report from a so-called safety committee. She stated she had not personally supervised the demolition and had only been informed after the work was already complete. Tessa did not present the footage yet, choosing instead to lock Marlene into that sworn answer first. Judge Roland Pierce issued a temporary restraining order against the association and demanded Silver Pines turn over its complete documentation within 7 days. Immediately after the hearing, Marlene called an emergency resident meeting, telling neighbors that Grant was attempting to extort the community and that if the association lost the case, every homeowner could face tens of thousands of dollars in special assessments. Signs soon appeared near Grant's property, reading that neighbors should not be forced to pay for someone else's abandoned house. Grant did not respond publicly. He built a temporary fence around the foundation and focused entirely on gathering evidence. Engineer Paige Sutton arrived to inspect the site independently and noticed the demolition crew had dug unusually deep beneath the location where Grant's office once stood, as though searching for something rather than simply clearing debris. Grant remembered that a floor safe beneath his office had once held the original 1898 deed, a historic boundary map records, proving ownership of the old access road, a written purchase offer from Marlene herself, and a backup hard drive containing digital copies of everything. The safe was gone. Tessa began to suspect the true target was never just the house, but the paperwork proving Grant controlled the only road corridor the association actually needed. Tessa dug through public planning records and discovered Silver Pines had been quietly negotiating with a real estate developer called North Vale Development. The plan called for 74 new villas, a small retail center, an upgraded clubhouse, and a private connector road linking the community directly to the highway, a road that would need to cut straight through Grant's land. If completed, The project stood to raise the total value of Silver Pine's real estate by more than $30 million, and Marlene had already signed a memorandum promising the developer control of the road corridor before the 1st of September, or the entire deal would collapse. Grant realized his farmhouse sat directly in the path of that proposed road. Tessa laid out her theory: plainly destroy the house, declare the land abandoned, bury it in association fees, force a low-value auction, and let a shell company connected to the developer quietly buy the parcel. Bank subpoenas soon confirmed that Silver Pines had transferred $140,000 from its reserve fund into an account labeled Community Safety Improvements, the exact account used to pay the demolition crew. Another $65,000 had gone to a consulting firm owned by Marlene's own sister, despite no clear services ever being provided. Tessa traced the shell company named in the memorandum back to a registered agent who had also filed paperwork for 2 other entities connected to Marlene's late husband's estate. None of the 3 companies had employees' offices or any operating history beyond holding real estate briefly before flipping it to larger developers at a markup. Tessa began to suspect this was not the first time Marlene had used her position within a homeowners association to manufacture a forced sale, and she requested records from 2 other communities Marlene had once served on the board of years earlier, hoping to establish a pattern the court could not dismiss as coincidence. Wade brought Nolan Price in for questioning, and the contractor admitted Marlene had told him Grant was deceased with no surviving heirs, and that when he asked about the belongings inside, she instructed him to demolish everything since it had all been left behind. Nolan also revealed he had personally watched Marlene remove a metal safe from the site before the crew finished something he had stayed silent about out of fear of losing his contracting license. Once he learned the demolition permit itself had been forged, he agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. Sensing the walls closing in, Marlene offered Grant a private settlement, proposing the association erase his $184,000 debt, pay him $350,000, purchase the 6-acre strip for $600,000 and require his signature on a confidentiality agreement. Grant refused. Marlene raised the offer to $1.2 million and warned that a prolonged lawsuit could bankrupt him before it ever reached trial. Grant told her she had destroyed a home worth more than her offer, stolen his property, and attempted to seize his land outright, and that this was no longer something a quiet check could resolve. The association then petitioned the court to force Grant into mediation, and Tessa agreed, knowing it would give Marlene more opportunities to make statements later usable against her. During mediation, Marlene falsely claimed Grant had once signed an agreement joining the homeowners association voluntarily. Tessa demanded the original document, and the association's lawyer produced a form bearing what appeared to be Grant's signature. Grant looked at the date and laughed out loud, because on that exact day, he had been working at a wildlife preserve more than 1,000 miles away from Silver Pines entirely. A handwriting expert soon confirmed that the signature on the association enrollment form had been copied directly from an old permit Grant had filed years earlier, meaning someone had physically lifted his signature and pasted it onto a fabricated document. Association Treasurer Colleen Frazier quietly reached out to Tessa shortly after that revelation surfaced. Colleen had originally believed the demolition plan carried proper legal approval since Marlene told the board the house was unclaimed property and that county officials had demanded immediate action. Once the lawsuit began, Colleen reviewed the meeting archive herself and discovered Marlene had altered the official minutes. The original record showed the board had only approved hiring an inspector to evaluate the house, with no vote ever taken authorizing demolition. A week later, the system record had been quietly rewritten to show a unanimous vote in favor of tearing the structure down. Colleen had already saved an offline copy of the original file before the change occurred, along with emails in which Marlene wrote that once the house disappeared, Holloway would have nothing left to defend and that the land would essentially pay for itself. Another email sent to the developer read that the road corridor would be cleared ahead of schedule and that the landowner would have no remaining choice but to sell. Colleen feared that testifying openly would make her a pariah within the community, but Tessa explained that staying silent could make her appear complicit in both forgery and financial misconduct. Colleen ultimately agreed to hand over everything. Through her emails, they learned that Grant's stolen safe had been moved into a storage unit rented by the association, and Wade quickly obtained a search warrant to access it. Colleen also described the atmosphere inside board meetings during the weeks leading up to the demolition, explaining that Marlene had grown increasingly secretive, scheduling side conversations with only 2 trusted board members, rather than discussing plans openly with the full group. She recalled Marlene dismissing questions about the demolition timeline by insisting speed was essential to protect the community from liability, a justification that made little sense for a house Marlene herself had never once inspected in person before ordering it destroyed. Colleen said she had trusted the process because she trusted the office. Marlene held not the woman herself, and that distinction had cost her more sleep than she cared to admit once the truth began surfacing. Inside the unit, deputies found the pride-open safe Grant's original deed, the historic boundary map, several family heirlooms, the association's own backup server, and dozens of boxes of documents marked for destruction. The hard drive that had once been stored inside the safe, however, was nowhere to be found. Marlene claimed the demolition crew had moved the safe into storage on their own initiative to protect the homeowner's property, but the footage clearly showed her personally ordering it removed from the site that very morning. Page completed her preliminary damage report, and it painted a very different picture than the one the association had presented publicly. The house was nowhere near the collapsing ruin Silver Pines had described. Satellite imagery repair invoices and insurance filings proved the roof had been replaced only 2 years earlier. The electrical system had been fully upgraded, and the foundation remained structurally sound. The association had known this, because Grant had filed renovation records with the county, even though he had never been obligated to inform Silver Pines of any work at all. Page also discovered the demolition crew had deliberately destroyed the water well, the storage tank, and the underground electrical lines, dramatically increasing the eventual cost of any rebuild. Marlene began losing control of the narrative as the case advanced. During one board meeting, she forced Colleen's resignation and accused her of stealing association records, unaware that Colleen had already recorded the entire exchange. In that recording, Marlene told the remaining board members that if everyone kept the same story straight, Holloway would never be able to prove anything at all, a statement that became direct evidence of coordinated concealment. Realizing she could no longer deny the demolition itself, Marlene shifted her strategy entirely. She claimed Grant had deliberately let the house fall into disrepair to manufacture an insurance claim, and that he had known about the coming demolition, but chose not to stop it because he wanted the payout. The association released photographs, showing a few rotted porch boards, overgrown grass, and a cracked window. Tessa proved the images had actually been taken 4 years earlier, immediately following a storm, and that every repair shown had been completed within 3 weeks according to the invoices on file. Marlene then accused Grant of installing illegal surveillance to spy on neighboring residents. Grant explained the camera sat entirely on his own land, faced only his private driveway, and had never recorded any homeowner association property at all. When the smear campaign failed to gain traction, Marlene filed a countersuit against Grant seeking $3 million, claiming he had damaged property values and harmed the association's reputation. Tessa moved to dismiss the countersuit immediately, and Judge Pierce not only granted the motion but formally warned the association's attorney against using litigation as a tool of intimidation. During the deposition process, Tessa questioned each board member individually, and most admitted they had simply trusted whatever information Marlene provided them. Marlene alone had hired the contractor, supplied the falsified permit, approved every payment, altered the meeting minutes, negotiated privately with the developer, kept possession of Grant's stolen safe, and personally directed communications with residents throughout the entire ordeal. When it was finally her turn to answer questions, Marlene repeatedly claimed she could not recall key details, insisting once again that she had never actually been present during the demolition. Tessa played the footage from Grant's wildlife camera in front of the entire room. The office fell silent as Marlene appeared clearly on screen, standing directly in front of the house and pointing toward the approaching bulldozer. Tessa then played the audio the same camera had captured, in which Marlene's voice could be heard, instructing the crew to tear everything down and leave nothing behind that might let him come back and live there again. The association's attorney immediately requested a recess as Marlene realized her sworn denial had just been proven false on record. Following the deposition, the association's liability insurer announced it might deny coverage altogether, since Marlene's actions appeared deliberate and fraudulent rather than accidental, meaning she and the board could ultimately be held personally responsible for the financial fallout. Residents of Silver Pines slowly began turning against their own president, demanding access to the road corridor project files and asking why reserve funds had financed an unauthorized demolition in the first place. Marlene refused to step down, insisting that removing her would cost every resident their share of the $30 million development windfall entirely. At a packed community meeting, one longtime resident stood up and asked Marlene directly why the board had never held an open vote on either the demolition or the road project before either one moved forward. Marlene answered that speed had been necessary to secure favorable terms with the developer and that bringing every decision to a full vote would have jeopardized the entire deal. Another resident asked why association funds meant for pool maintenance and landscaping had instead financed a private legal defense fund, and Marlene abruptly ended the meeting rather than answer. Several residents later told Tessa they had left that evening feeling for the first time that they might be looking at a stranger rather than the woman who had led their community for 6 years. Around this time, Tessa received the analysis results from the recovered hard drive found hidden inside Marlene's own office. Although many files had been deleted, forensic specialists managed to recover a planning document titled Final Phase Holloway Asset Recovery. The plan described the exact sequence of events that had already unfolded: declare the structure dangerous, demolish it while the owner was away, bury him under fees and penalties, place a lien on the property, purchase the land through an intermediary company, and hand the road corridor over to the developer once the deal closed successfully. To prepare for trial, Tessa needed to prove the damages went far beyond the cost of building materials. Grant's house stood as one of the last surviving structures of its kind in the region, with several elements handcrafted from American chestnut wood that had become commercially extinct decades earlier. Inside had once stood an original wooden staircase, a sandstone fireplace, stained glass windows dating back to the early 1900s. Built-in cabinetry restored personally by Grant's grandfather, a collection of historic land surveying tools and furniture custom-fitted to every room in the house. Page worked alongside preservation specialists to calculate the true cost of restoring the property to its original condition. Sourcing comparable wood and recreating the handcrafted details alone exceeded $2,700,000, while restoring the well system, landscaping, stone fencing, and outbuildings pushed the total recovery cost past $4 million. On top of that came temporary housing expenses, loss of use, the value of destroyed belongings, the cost of restoring lost documents, professional losses tied to Grant's career, legal fees, emotional distress, trespassing damages, and punitive penalties tied to intentional fraud. Grant did not want the case reduced to a simple pursuit of money. He insisted the primary goal was forcing the association to rebuild the house on its original site and in its original design. Tessa warned him that reconstruction could take years to complete, but Grant refused to accept a settlement that merely replaced the house with cash. Money could not restore history, he told her, not while the people who destroyed it were allowed to simply walk away unaccountable. He explained to Tessa that his grandfather had spent nearly 3 years converting the old lodge into a proper family home working weekends, alongside 2 neighbors who no longer lived in the area, and that every room carried some trace of that labor even after decades of small renovations. Losing the structure felt less like losing a building, and more like losing the last physical record of people who were no longer alive to tell their own version of that story. Tessa began drafting the request for court-ordered reconstruction, with that context in mind, knowing a jury would need to understand the house as something closer to an heirloom than an asset. Before trial, the association made a final offer of $4,500,000, but only on the condition Grant abandon his demand for reconstruction and sell the road corridor strip outright. That single condition confirmed the road had remained the true objective the entire time. Grant refused once again. Meanwhile, Wade forwarded the forged permit and stolen safe evidence to the county prosecutor, launching a parallel criminal investigation alongside the civil lawsuit already underway. Marlene attempted to sell her vacation home and transfer assets into a private trust, prompting Tessa to request an emergency asset freeze due to clear signs of concealment. Judge Pierce granted the freeze and further ordered the association barred from collecting any special assessment from residents to fund Marlene's personal legal defense. That ruling pushed other board members to begin negotiating separately with Grant, offering testimony in exchange for leniency regarding claims against those not directly involved in the scheme, and Grant agreed to evaluate each case individually based on their actual level of responsibility. Colleen prepared to serve as the prosecution's key witness. Just before trial began, she delivered one final folder to Tessa, containing a private presentation Marlene had shown the developer behind closed doors. The final page read simply that without the house, there would be no owner left with enough standing to resist the project, and Tessa decided immediately that this exact line would open her statement to the jury. The trial drew attention from across the entire county. The association's defense portrayed the entire incident as an unfortunate administrative error, arguing the board genuinely believed the structure posed a danger and never intended to cause Grant any harm. Tessa opened by reading aloud the line from Marlene's private presentation that without the house there would be no owner left with enough standing to resist the project. Then walked the jury through the evidence in careful chronological order. She began with the deed, proving the land had never belonged to the homeowners association, followed by the repeated purchase offers. Grant had refused. Then the $30 million development agreement, and finally the forged permit, the forged, falsified signature, and the altered meeting minutes. Nolan Price took the stand and admitted he had never independently verified the permit, with the county trusting Marlene's assurance that everything had been handled properly. He described how she ordered the crew to destroy the belongings inside the home, and personally directed the removal of the metal safe before anyone else could see it. Page presented a detailed three-dimensional model of the house, built from blueprints, photographs, and insurance data, proving the structure had been sound, and that no legitimate engineering justification existed for an emergency. Demolition. She walked the jury through the foundation inspection reports, filed only 2 years earlier, pointing out that the same reports Marlene claimed to have relied on had never actually been requested by anyone at the association. Colleen submitted her emails, the recorded meeting and the original unaltered minutes, as evidence explaining in careful detail how the digital record had been changed and when. Wade confirmed that no government agency had ever authorized the destruction of Grant's home and that the county had no record of receiving so much as a single complaint about the property in over a decade. Finally, Grant himself took the stand, describing the moment he returned home to find nothing but bare foundation where his house once stood. He did not exaggerate his emotions, simply listing what had been lost and what each item had meant to his family. When the association's attorney asked why Grant had not taken his important documents with him while traveling for work, Grant answered that he never imagined he needed to carry his deed around just to stop a neighbor from tearing his house down while he was away. When Marlene finally took the stand, she insisted the recovered planning document had only ever been a rough strategic draft that was never actually carried out. Tessa asked why all 6 steps outlined in that plan had occurred in the exact order described. Marlene called it coincidence. Tessa played the footage of Marlene overseeing the demolition, and Marlene claimed she had only come to ensure everyone's safety. Tessa played the recording of her ordering the crew to tear down everything, and Marlene insisted her words had been taken out of context. When confronted with the email describing a $750,000 success fee tied to the land seizure, Marlene claimed it represented a legitimate consulting payment until Tessa produced records proving the payment was scheduled to flow directly into an account. Marlene personally controlled. She had no explanation left. Judge Pierce repeatedly asked her to answer questions directly, but Marlene continued deflecting blame onto her attorney, the contractor, the treasurer, and the rest of the board. The decisive moment came when Tessa produced the pried-open safe itself, asking Marlene why Grant's personal property had been discovered inside an association storage unit. Marlene claimed she had only been trying to protect it. When Tessa asked why the original deed had been removed from that safe and placed into a folder marked for destruction, Marlene said nothing at all. The jury returned after 2 days of deliberation. They found the Silver Pines Homeowners Association and Marlene Whitaker liable for trespass, intentional destruction of property fraud, forgery conversion of personal property, conspiracy to seize ownership rights, abuse of legal process, and severe emotional distress. The foreperson read each finding slowly, and by the third count, several jurors were visibly glancing toward Marlene rather than the judge. The jury set total compensatory and punitive damages at $12 million, a figure the courtroom clerk had to repeat once the murmuring in the gallery grew loud enough to drown out the first reading. Marlene's face went pale, though the financial judgment was not what shocked her most. Grant had specifically requested an unusual remedy, asking the court to order full reconstruction of the house, rather than simply awarding its market value in cash. Judge Pierce agreed, ruling that the home held historical, emotional, and architectural value that money alone could never fully replace, and that the demolition had been carried out intentionally to strip Grant of his ownership rights entirely. The court ordered the association to rebuild the house on its original foundation, matching its original structure using materials equal to or better than the originals, with Grant given final approval over the architect and contractor chosen for the project. An independent expert appointed by the court would oversee construction, and the association would be required to pay for the entire rebuild separate from the $12 million award. Work had to begin within 90 days, and the association was ordered to fully restore the well, the storage barn, the stone fencing, the landscaping, and the original driveway. Any recovered property had to be returned to Grant immediately, and Marlene was permanently barred from holding a leadership position in any residential association within the court's jurisdiction. The judge also forwarded a full transcript of Marlene's testimony to the prosecutor for review of possible perjury charges. The proposed road corridor deal collapsed entirely, as Northvale Development terminated its agreement with the association and filed its own lawsuit, demanding the return of advance payments already made. Marlene attempted to slip out through a side exit but was stopped by Wade, who informed her she was under arrest on charges connected to forgery, theft of property, and obstruction of a criminal investigation. Grant felt no urge to celebrate as he watched Marlene led away in handcuffs. He only looked toward the recovered safe, which now held what little remained of the life he had once built inside that house. Residents of Silver Pines voted to remove the entire board shortly afterward, and a temporary oversight committee was appointed to audit the association's finances and cooperate directly with the court. Several residents apologized to Grant for having trusted Marlene's version of events for so long, and Grant accepted their apologies, while reminding them that an association only holds power for as long as its residents refuse to. Demand transparency. Reconstruction took 18 months from start to finish. Grant selected a preservation architect and a crew of craftsmen who specialized in restoring historic homes, drawing on old photographs, insurance records, prior survey scans, and salvaged fragments of the original materials to recreate every detail with precision. The staircase was rebuilt to match its original curve exactly. The stone fireplace was reassembled using recovered pieces of the original rock. The stained glass windows were remade using traditional glasswork techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen. Certain undamaged fragments of the original wood were deliberately worked into the new office, standing as proof that the house had been destroyed once but never erased from its own history. The association was also ordered to restore the row of maple trees along the entrance and replace the original Holloway family sign Marlene had torn down before the demolition began. Grant visited the site every few weeks throughout construction, often arriving early enough to watch the crew set the morning's first beam before the rest of the county was even awake. He kept a small notebook documenting each stage of the rebuild, partly for his own records, and partly because Tessa wanted a clean paper trail in case the association tried to cut corners once public attention faded. The court-appointed inspector visited twice a month, comparing every completed section against the original blueprints and photographs, and on the 2 occasions where materials fell short of the required standard, the inspector ordered the work torn out and redone at the association's expense. Grant did not keep the entire settlement for himself. A portion of the award went toward establishing a fund to support other landowners facing illegal seizure attempts by residential associations across the state. He also funded the digitization of the county's older land records, helping other property owners protect their deeds and boundaries from the same kind of manipulation he had endured. Silver Pines adopted a new set of governing rules requiring resident approval for any major expenditure, permanent logging of every change made to meeting minutes, a ban on any single individual approving contracts alone, mandatory government, verification for any action involving private property, public disclosure of conflicts of interest among board members, and full resident access to financial records at any time. Colleen assisted the new oversight committee through the transition period, but declined to accept any permanent leadership role afterward, wanting to prove her cooperation had come from a sense of responsibility rather than a desire for power. Nolan lost several contracts because of the scandal, but kept his license after fully cooperating with investigators and accepting responsibility for failing to verify the paperwork himself. He offered to contribute free labor toward the reconstruction, but Grant insisted every worker be paid fairly and transparently for their time. Marlene was convicted in a separate criminal trial on charges including forgery, theft, and conspiracy after prosecutors used the same recovered planning document and camera footage that had already sealed her fate in civil court. Beyond prison time and steep fines, she was ordered to surrender the money she had received from the developer, and her vacation home was ultimately sold to help satisfy a portion of the civil judgment against her. The 2 board members who had quietly assisted her testified against her in exchange for reduced penalties, while the remaining members who claimed ignorance throughout the process were ordered to complete community oversight training before ever serving on a residential board again. On the day the reconstruction was finally completed, Grant stood on the new porch and looked out across Silver Pines. Almost everything looked exactly as it once had, though not quite in every way. The rebuilt house included stronger fire resistance, a more reinforced foundation, and a storage room designed specifically to withstand tampering. Tessa told him it was likely the only home in the entire county ever rebuilt under a direct court order. Grant framed a copy of the final judgment and hung it inside his office. Beneath it, he mounted the restored original sign, now reading Private Property Holloway House, established 1898. Tessa visited once construction wrapped and walked the grounds slowly, remarking that she had handled property disputes for over a decade, but had never once seen a court order, an association to rebuild what it destroyed brick by brick. Grant told her the money had never been the point, though he was grateful the fund now existed to help someone else who might otherwise have no way to fight back against a board convinced it answered to no one. In the final scene, a new association vehicle pulled up outside the gate. The newly elected board president stepped out, carrying no fine notice and no attorney at her side, only a folder requesting permission to repair a drainage line running near the property boundary. Grant reviewed the request, signed his approval, and told her that this was exactly how neighbors were supposed to resolve their problems. As the camera pulled back, the rebuilt house stood exactly where Marlene had once believed she had erased every trace of Grant's ability to fight back. Marlene believed a single bulldozer could remove Grant from his own land entirely. In the end, it only unearthed the evidence that buried her career, her freedom, and every ounce of power she had ever held over Silver Pines.